And I really want to start with something that Judith talked about, and that is popular culture. I think a really important question to really frame the way we think about pirates, especially in the Atlantic, is why do we like them so much? Why are we in love with these characters, these criminals, these people that committed crimes, often violent crimes, often reprehensible crimes, yet we have a fascination with them in a way that maybe carries over a little bit to the present day, but I think even today we don't really like pirates, but in the past we do. We love pirates. And I think Judith gives a lot of good ways to think about why that is, that they were really the original anti-heroes. They were the outlaws, they were the underdogs, right? They were going against the system, going against the man, so to speak. And so I think in a lot of ways we can relate to them. They were also progressive, more progressive than a lot of the people that they were fighting against. Generally more democratic, more egalitarian, more racially tolerant than a lot of people in their own time. And so kind of keep this question alive in your mind, and maybe it's something that we can talk at the end of this lecture and during the lunch period. I've divided this into really 4 sections. I was really trying to think of how to capture this subject fully. And the order, I think, kind of speaks to what I was just talking about, pirates being underdogs. We really start in the earliest, maybe not the earliest part of the early modern period, but the earliest part of the early modern period for pirates in the 16th century, when it was the weakest states, particularly England, that really sponsored pirates. You can think of England as the underdog at one point. Eventually the pirates began to feast on the English state. And that's really the second stage in which pirates became a threat to the country that they had once helped. The process that was discussed in the previous lecture about the growth of the modern state, I think, comes into play in the 18th century, in which we see the state, in this case the British state, the British Empire, really co-opting piracy for its own ends in the form of privateering. Again, privateering is, if you're thinking about the distinction, is really legal piracy, at least in the eyes of the state that's sponsoring it. Privateers carried letters of commission, letters of marque, that gave them the authority, in essence, to be pirates. And then last, I want to think about the subject of my own research, so it's a little bit self-indulgent, but I think it's relevant, press gangs, and the way that the British Navy, again, really kind of co-opted a practice that was associated with piracy, and that was capturing men at sea and forcing them into service. And so the takeaway here, I think, is that pirates are fun. Pirates are fun to learn about, but they're also important, incredibly important to major historical developments, to the growth of the modern state, I think to the growth of capitalism, individual liberties, a lot of different areas in which piracy intersects with big topics. And so you don't have to feel guilty teaching about them to your students, right? It's a relevant academic subject, as today proves. So if we are thinking about the origins of this in the Atlantic, I think we have to start with the Spanish Empire. The Spanish are really the first to figure out a way to really profit in an amazing way from the riches of the New World. To paraphrase the previous talk, they became the hosts for the parasites, and they attracted the attention of other European countries. And this really began after Cortez conquered the Aztecs in present-day Mexico in 1519 to 1521, discovered the fabulous riches there. That was followed up by the discovery of the amazing silver mines of Central America and South America. And by the mid-16th century, the Spanish had begun the system that's depicted in this slide called the flota system, or the fleet system, in which basically there were twice a year, in January and August, there were fleets of ships that left Spain for the New World to basically carry all the loot, right? The Spanish galleons were gonna travel to the New World. And you can see as they come from Spain, they fan out into different parts of the Western Hemisphere, down to South America, places in the Caribbean. But then they come back together at Havana, from which they embark back to Spain, again, twice a year. And so So this convoy of ships really became the target for Atlantic pirates in the 17th century. And the first group that really attacked the flota system were the French. The French and the Spanish were at war for much of the first half of the 16th century, and so the French, in many respects, were the first really excellent pirates in the Atlantic. Eventually the English would displace them, but the French began the system. Eventually the French and Spanish reach a peace by 1559, and it was at that time that a new monarch was ascending the throne in England, Queen Elizabeth I. And it was under Elizabeth that the English really got into the game of piracy slash privateering. And it was because I think two things came together. One was the relative weakness of the English state. There's no such thing as the English Empire really at this point. But the weakness of that state and the ambition to be something more, the ambition to be something bigger. And how would England, how could England get into this game in the New World? And it was really through piracy. Elizabeth, the English state, sponsored ship captains who basically made war on the Spanish Empire. The biggest names from this practice were John Hawkins and Francis Drake. These two men came from merchant families. Talked about the slave trade in the previous talk. They were both involved in the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. And so it was kind of a natural extension for them to attack the Spanish Empire. And these men become known as Elizabeth's sea dogs. I really like that term. And if there's a top dog, a top sea dog, it was Francis Drake. Drake led all kinds of incursions into the Spanish Caribbean in the 1560s. He becomes known as El Drake to the Spanish. But for at least the initial attacks, he really is more of a parasite than anything. It wasn't putting a real threat to the amazing power and riches of the Spanish New World. That really changed in 1572 when Drake conceived of a really ingenious plan to disrupt the flota system. He decided that he was going to steal the annual shipment of treasure that came from South America, from the really vast region that the Spanish referred to as Peru. And I'll show you, come back to our map here. If you look at the Isthmus of Panama and where the shipment comes from Peru, it would land there basically on the southern part of the isthmus, and it was transported by mules to the northern part, where then it would connect back to Havana. And so Drake realized that this was a choke point. This was the place to attack all of this, mostly silver and gold that was coming from South America. And in 1572, he pulled it off with the help of African Maroons. He was a slave trader, but he also saw the value of slaves, freed blacks. If they were going to help his cause, African Maroons helped him, and also French Huguenots, French Protestants, and basically made enough money to be rich the rest of his life. Everybody that was part of that particular operation, but he didn't stop there. He followed that up. It's kind of hard. What do you do as an encore once you've sacked the great silver shipment? But he came up with an encore in December of 1577. He embarked on what would become known as his famous voyage, and he became the second person to circumnavigate the globe after Magellan. Quite a time after. This took about 50 years for somebody to do this again, but he wasn't doing it just as a tourist. He was committing acts of piracy all along the way, particularly against the Spanish, so that by the time he got back to England 3 years later, he had a load estimated in close to today's money, in more than $1 million in English pounds in terms of all the wealth that he had taken. And so eventually this becomes a problem for the Spanish. And this and other factors led to war, open war between Spain and England for roughly the last 18 years of Elizabeth's reign, from 1585 to 1603. Drake continued his various activities, the most famous of which was his voyage in 1585, 1586. And when I say voyage, this is now becoming what we might consider almost a small navy. He had 22 vessels and more than 2,000 men under his command, and he sacked Santo Domingo, today the capital of the Dominican Republic, and you can kind of see the number of ships and how really defenseless this particular port was. He went from there and attacked Cartagena, and this really led to increased Spanish defenses. We think about the Spanish castles in the Caribbean and their forts. A lot of that was in response to the English pirates. So eventually Spain decided to respond. That happened in 1588 with the famous Spanish Armada that was sent to England. This was a fleet of 130 ships carrying 18,000 soldiers to try to put down this English threat once and for all. This became the great legend in English history that the so-called Protestant wind came and rescued England from the attack of the Spanish Armada. It seems that there were actually severe storms at the time that made it hard for the Spanish to succeed in maintaining control of the English Channel. The way that the English commemorative medal phrased it that came out after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, it said, "God breathed and they were scattered." So summed it up. This didn't end the conflict between England and Spain, and in fact, Spain and just about everybody else. The Dutch and the French were also at war with the Spanish at the end of the 16th century, and this is one of the famous tales of early modern European history, that the Spanish eventually exhausted themselves at war. And so they eventually made peace with these different countries in 1598 with the French, in 1604 with England, and in 1607 with the Dutch. As for Drake, his life proved that piracy was dangerous business. When he was attacking Havana in 1595, he had a cannonball that shot through the cabin of his ship. He was injured, but somehow survived that, only to die in a less glorious way from dysentery at Panama a little time after. And after Elizabeth's death in 1603, I think there's a real shift in terms of English participation in the New World. There's a shift from piracy, from being the parasite, to really trying to build something permanent under James I. And so you see the first permanent colonies beginning in the Caribbean and in Virginia. And at that time, piracy continued, but it changed. Instead of emanating from the center of the empire, the mother country, England, it really comes from the colonies themselves. And individual governors sponsored pirates, basically because there wasn't adequate naval defense. They become an extension of the colonial governments. And I think the figure that best captures this transition in the 17th century was Sir Captain Henry Morgan. And yes, this is Captain Morgan of the television advertisements today. At least that's who they're alluding to. Under Morgan, pirates begin to get their reputation for their libertine lifestyle, for having a good time, for drinking and gambling and dancing, and basically sticking their thumb up at social mores and social conventions. He first came to the Caribbean in the 1650s. We think he was part of Oliver Cromwell's ill-fated attempt to conquer the Spanish Caribbean, called the Western Design. So he was part of that military force, and then he just stayed, and he continued to receive letters of marque from different colonial governors. The men that sailed with Morgan were known as buccaneers, so that's when this term starts to be used. And he set up what was really an incredibly democratic pay structure for the time, for all the ships that he captured. he himself would get 1/100th a share of the loot. And by comparison, in a privateer vessel, captain would get 14 times that amount. They get somewhere around half, and something close to another half would go to the crown, and another half. I think I'm doing Yogi Berra math here, but basically the point is, the individual sailors didn't end up with very much. Some more than they could make maybe an average merchant ship. But Morgan really believed in spreading the wealth, and I think he found that it was a good business. And so he had a lot of success in the 1660s. In 1670, he maybe bit off more than he could chew. He attacked Panama. He wasn't successful, and it turns out his actions actually violated a peace treaty that had been signed between England and Spain. He claimed he didn't know about the treaty, but I think there's evidence that he did. So he was arrested. He was sent back to England, to London, and he just kind of festered there for a few years. And then the relations between the Spanish and the English deteriorated again. And Morgan all of a sudden was back in vogue. He was knighted, and he was sent back to the Caribbean, sent back to Jamaica as a lieutenant governor. So now the inmates are really running the asylum. They've made the privateer part of the official government. He didn't have a really successful time as a politician. He wasn't, even though maybe being a pirate has certain skills that lends itself to being a good politician. That wasn't the case at Morgan's experience. He fell out of favor. Among other things, the governor and the council of Jamaica had to continually condemn him for his rowdy drunkenness, and we're not exactly sure how Morgan died, but there's different theories. He died in 1688, and one of the real possibilities is that he died of liver disease. That's something the Captain Morgan ads don't mention. They also don't mention that the rum today is made basically from Puerto Rico, even though Morgan is connected to Jamaica, of course. So I mentioned that Morgan's this transitional figure. He's kind of a transitional figure from pirates acting for the state to pirates really acting for themselves, being free agents. And that's what really came next in the late 17th century and the early 18th century. And as the English state grew in strength and became something of an empire, they didn't need the pirates as much. And they really needed to rein them in, gain control of them. And by contrast, the pirates found that the Spanish weren't producing as much wealth as before. The way to make money was to attack their own country, the shipping, English shipping, and that's basically when the English state had to step in and make war on the pirates they had once sponsored. The person who captures this transition the best, I think, is Captain Kidd, Captain William Kidd. All these people, these legends, they were real people. At one time. Sometimes it's hard to separate the legend from reality. Kidd was born in Scotland. He eventually ended up settling in New York City. Like Morgan in Jamaica, he became one of these figures that was sponsored by the colonial government. He was sponsored mostly by the colonial government in New York. His target was more often French ships than Spanish ships, as France became England's primary enemy. And he was so good at his craft that he gained the trust of the English government, and he was actually given a mission to become a pirate hunter. And this happened at the end of the 17th century in 1696. And specifically, he was supposed to go to the Indian Ocean, and he was supposed to try to eliminate these English pirates that were feasting on the English East India Company and the trade in that particular ocean. And so he got his ship. It's called the Adventure Galley. Great name for a pirate ship. He left, at least tried to leave London. So tried to sail out of the Thames. On the Thames, he passed a royal yacht, and by custom, a ship like Kidd's really should have dipped its colors. It should have lowered its flag as sort of an act of deference. It didn't do that. This royal yacht fired a shot over the bow of the adventure gallery, after which Kidd and his men all mooned the royal yacht. And I know we have children in the room, so I'm talking about the celestial heavens. And they must have thought it was funny because they did it to the next royal vessel that they came upon as they entered the English Channel. That particular vessel didn't find it very funny at all, and managed to stop the adventure galley and impress most of its crew. So Kidd had to go and recruit basically a new crew for this mission to go to the Indian Ocean and stop piracy there. And so Kidd had many adventures in the Indian Ocean, and whether it was part of his sanction or not, he ended up taking a lot of prizes himself. I think he not only stopped the pirates, but he kind of became the lead pirate there himself. Word of this got back to England, and all of a sudden he became the enemy, the person that had been the pirate hunter. His old patron, the governor of New York, the Earl of Ballamont, himself was nervous that he would get implicated with Kidd's bad reputation. So Ballamont basically invited Kidd to New York to take safe haven, at which point he had him arrested and sent to London. Kidd, you can see the outcome of the trial here. Kidd was put on trial for murder and for 5 counts of piracy in the Indian Ocean. Again, I think he captures this kind of blurred line between pirates and privateers. He was acting with some commission from the English government, but the argument was that he had gone past what he had been asked to do. So he was hanged at Execution Dock. That was on the eastern side of the Thames. If you know London, that was the poorer side, or the neighborhood of Wapping was and is, which was the sailor neighborhood in that time. And they left him hanging there for 3 years as a warning to other pirates not to do the same. And so I think Atlantic historians interpret this as really the opening salvo in the war on the pirates that the Royal Navy commenced in the early 18th century. Again, what they had once sponsored had gotten out of control, particularly in the Caribbean, where there was dozens, possibly hundreds of pirates operating. There was a war that interfered with, there was an actual war, a war against a European state that interfered with the pirate war, the War of the Spanish Succession that took place from 1702 to 1713. So there was a brief pause after Kidd's hanging in the war on pirates, but then it commenced again after the Peace of Utrecht, which was agreed to in 1713. This period, I like this because we heard about today's, the more recent golden age of piracy, so I should call this maybe the first golden age of piracy, took place after this war in the 17 teens. And this was common. This was a common pattern for piracy. There wouldn't be a lot of piracy during wartime, other than the privateering, which was sanctioned by the state. But what you might call the illicit piracy would happen after a war. And that was because the English Royal Navy demobilized. There was mass unemployment. All of these men that didn't want to be in the Navy in the first place now were completely out of a job, and so maybe they missed their old wage, such as it was. And in unemployment, a lot of them turned to piracy. And one way to interpret this, and I think this was mentioned earlier, this was their way to get back, really, at the Navy, the way they had been treated, the way they had been treated on various merchant ships. And so at the end of this war, in the 17 teens, there's a colonial customs officer in Philadelphia that warned, all the news of America is the swarming of pirates, not only on these coasts, that all the West Indies over, which doth ruin make 10 times worse than a war. The colonial estimates, these are the estimates at the time, were that by 1716 there were upwards of 2,000 pirates operating throughout the Caribbean. And so this was the age of Jack Sparrow. This is the pirates of the Caribbean, and this is the age of the Jolly Roger, the pirate flag, which would be raised if they were targeting a merchant vessel. They did that so that the vessel would have a chance to surrender. If the vessel didn't surrender, they would raise a second flag. Often it would be red, and that was the flag of no return. That basically meant that pirate ship was going to make war on that particular vessel. And as I mentioned in a second, there was a lot of variations on the Jolly Roger. That was a term at the time for kind of a carefree person, and somehow, connection with the pirates eventually became shorthand for their flag. So there's a great Bob Dylan lyric. There's a lot of great Bob Dylan lyrics, but in the song "Absolutely Sweet Marie," Dylan sings, and I won't do the Dylan voice. To live outside the law, you must be honest. And this was mentioned before in terms of the pirates, that there was a certain code to being a pirate. They certainly broke the law, but it wasn't that they didn't have ethics. And so in this golden age of piracy, you really see what's referred to in the movie The Pirates of the Caribbean as the pirate code. And there was actually something fairly similar, that when someone signed on to a pirate ship, they agreed to what we might call a constitution of sorts, a compact of behavior, how they would behave, what they would get out of the deal, which again was pretty equal share. The captain of a pirate ship was elected. There was one other officer position that was elected, the quartermaster position. The quartermaster kind of kept everything running on time, inflicted discipline if necessary, but if there was a serious crime, there was actually a jury of the crewmen that would decide the appropriate punishment. And the captain could be basically recalled, could be taken out of that leadership position if he wasn't serving very well. So I think this is part of the reason why pirates are appreciated, romanticized today. There's a good quote from a pirate, Bartholomew Roberts, who I think really summed up the attraction. And he was contrasting piracy with the real hierarchical systems that pirates were opposing, the Navy and merchant ships. And he said, there is thin commons, and he's talking about the merchant service here, there is thin commons, low wages, and hard labor. In this, piracy, there is plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. No, a merry life and a short one shall be my motto. So I like that. A merry life and a short one. The most famous pirate of this golden age was Blackbeard. Again, a real person. His name was Edward Teach, sometimes written as Treach, and some other variations. And his beard, his overall appearance, was really key to his legend. He famously lit his beard on fire on occasion as an act of intimidation. I assume he put it out before it became lethal. And the handful of eyewitness accounts we have of this person all comment on the beard. And this is one of them from a book called The History of the Pirates, which is really our best primary source on piracy from this age. And we don't know who wrote it. It's often attributed to Daniel Defoe, but that's questioned now. So it says, so our hero, Captain Teach, assumed the conjument of Blackbeard from that large quantity of hair which like a frightful meteor covered his whole face and frightened America more than any comet that has appeared there a long time. This beard was black, which he suffered to grow at an extravagant length. As to breadth, it came up to his eyes. He was accustomed to twist it with ribbons in small tails after the manner of our family's wigs, and turn them about his ears. So it sounds like quite a production. I mean, there's a lot going on with this beard. There's a lot of style involved with it. So Blackbeard was a successful pirate, if you count success in terms of the number of ships that he captured. He had this kind of scary, reputation, and he augmented this with his own variation of the Jolly Roger, in which there was a skeleton putting a spear through a heart. And what could be worse than that? Except you see he's holding something in his hand. He's doing all this while toasting the devil. So this is really scary stuff. So he had this whole presentation. He had the beard, he had the flag, but there's no evidence that he ever seriously harmed a captive, and no evidence that he murdered a captive, and that occasionally happened on other ships. So there was a lot of bluster, a lot of intimidation involved with Blackbeard. Deep down inside, I think he was just a real teddy bear. He was just misunderstood. But he was still a threat to shipping in the Americas, and so he was a prime target for the different governors in the colonies, which were increasingly depending on the wealth of various shipments. And the Virginia governor, Alexander Spotswood, basically put a bounty on Blackbeard's head in the mid-17 teens. And in 1718, a party of soldiers and sailors set out to capture him. And they did after a fierce battle off the coast of North Carolina. And this is one of the epic battles in pirate history and in the history of pirates. It goes on for pages and pages. Eventually, Blackbeard's head was severed after he had been killed, and it was put on the bowsprit of the ship that ultimately defeated him as proof. Like, how else do you prove that you killed Blackbeard? Well, you bring back the beard, right? And they got the bounty. Two other very famous pirates from this period were women. Anne Bonny here on the left, and Mary Read on the right. And there's a lot of legends associated with them, and it's a little bit hard, again, to separate fact from fiction, but the basic outline of their stories: Bonny was born in Ireland. She had a difficult childhood. Her mother died. She eventually settled with her father in South Carolina. She married a poor sailor named James Bonny, whom she eventually left for a much more attractive figure, the pirate John Calico Jack Rackham, who had the ship the Revenge, the pirate ship the Revenge, and Bonny serves basically as his first mate in different ways on this ship, and becomes a famous pirate herself. One of the people that they end up capturing at sea that ends up joining their ship was this person, Mary Read, who also went by the name Mark Read. Read had been born illegitimately in England. After her birth, her older brother died, and it's a little bit complicated here, the family story, but the older brother had been born legitimately. He was above board, and so when he died, her mother began dressing her as a boy to basically become that son, to escape the shame of the illegitimate birth. And it stuck. She continued to dress as a boy, and eventually a man for much of the rest of her life. She became a sailor. She eventually joined the British military, and in this same war I spoke of, the War of the Spanish Succession, it seems that she met a Flemish soldier and revealed herself as a woman, became married. After a while, he died, and so then she returned to sailing, what she knew best, just again as a man. When she got on this ship, she eventually revealed herself to Anne Bonny, And so the end of the story is a little bit tragic. During this war on the pirates, there's eventually a pirate hunter that comes after the Revenge, Jack Racken's ship. All the men on board were incapacitated by drink. They had had way too much to drink, and so the only people literally left to fight the pirate hunters were Anne Bonny and Mary Read. And according to the primary accounts, they put up a good fight. They held them off for a while, but eventually they lost. And they were arrested. And there's a great line that Anne Bonny says to this Calico Jack figure, the guy that she ran off with. She basically said, "If you hadn't been so stupid and drunk, we might have gotten out of this." You know, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what she said. So they were sentenced. They were arrested and kept in Jamaica. And they were to be executed, and that's what was done during this period, this war on the pirates. But they had a special defense. In the legal terminology of the day, they pleaded their bellies. Basically, they were both pregnant. And that got them a stay of execution. That got them a little break. Unfortunately, we think that Reed died in jail, possibly from a fever during childbirth, and it's not clear what happened to Bonny, but it probably wasn't a very good outcome. And so all of these stories, the way that they end for Blackbeard, for Bonny, for Reed, and the really hundreds of other pirates during this period, was a sad end. That we have some stats that between 1716 and 1726, the British executed upwards of 600 pirates. It's estimated that twice that number died in resisting capture in this kind of engagements that Bonny and Reed were a part of. And this is often marked as kind of the end of this era of the golden age of piracy, around 1725, 1726. But that doesn't mean that piratical activities ended in the Atlantic. I think it's just that the state had won, but they really kind of co-opted the tactics of pirates, and once again turned them into privateers. And I'm not going to go into this at great length, but just to give a couple of examples that are kind of nice 18th century paintings. This shows a famous privateering engagement during the 1740s, and the privateer, the Basque one, is the ship with the flag there. You can see the little British Union Jack there, and it became famous for really outrageous acts. And in this particular case, it attacked a convoy of 8 French merchant ships that were traveling from Martinique in the Caribbean back to France. And you can see to the right that it sank the lead ship in this convoy, the one that probably was armed the most for its defense. And it eventually took 5 of the 8 ships. And so the custom when this happened is you would take your prizes to a prize court, which were placed at different ports in the Atlantic, and you would basically, the crown would take its share, the captain would get his share, and then the crew, would get what was left. And again, this was more profitable than serving as a regular sailor in the Navy or on a merchant ship. Adam Smith, the great Scottish philosopher, called privateering the lottery of the sea. I really like that phrase, the lottery of the sea, that someone could strike it rich. In this case, the privateer, and I don't know if I gave his name. Let's see if I have his name. His last name is Walker. He ended up capturing the 5 ships. There was 960 hogsheads of sugar, worth thousands of pounds, 300,000 pounds of coffee, some cocoa as well, elephant's teeth, and gold dust. So that not a bad haul. Another thing that you see with privateering in the 18th century, if you remember, it began with the English out of a point of weakness, and the fact that they didn't really have a full respectable Navy. Well, the pattern repeats itself with the early United States. Privateering was incredibly important for America in the American Revolution and the War of 1812. There was only a handful of legitimate, what we call naval vessels, but there were hundreds of privateers, hundreds of people acting independently with the letters of marque. One of the most famous engagements with a privateer in the American Revolution is the one that's depicted in this image. What was going on, there was a Massachusetts privateer that was called Jack. I sometimes refer to it as Saucy Jack. I like that better. I like to think of it as Saucy Jack. And it was cruising off of Halifax, off of Nova Scotia, and it encountered this British brig, the Observer, which was actually on a mission to stop privateers and rescue another British vessel that had shipwrecked. This encounter lasted more than 2 hours, and just look at all the holes in the sails of the two vessels. I mean, it's really remarkable. These ships, it's like boxers, going to the 15th round, and they're barely still standing. Eventually, the Observer won this particular match, and this was the end of the career of the Saucy Jack, at least for this particular time. But in the big picture, this was an effective means, I think, for the United States to wage war against what was the superpower at the time, the British Empire. And so, I'd like now just to close with another example of how the state, in this case the British state, the British Empire, really captured and perfected tactics that were at one time really associated with pirates. And that tactic was impressment, essentially the forcible conscription of sailors. And this is something that this is actually disputed among scholars of Atlantic piracy, how much pirates forced men into service and how much they volunteered. And sometimes, it's kind of a blurred line. If a man didn't have a lot of choice, he might volunteer if it seemed like that was the best course in his self-interest. But this is something that the British Navy used to great effect in the 18th century. This is, we don't have any actual pictures of press gangs, but we have a lot of satirical cartoons. And this one captures really kind of the essence of the practice. The press gang would be led by a naval lieutenant. You would basically have a gang of toughs, either men that just lived on land, were part of the Navy, or at sea. There would usually be sailors that were part of this gang. They would usually use a long club called a cudgel to force men into service. They wouldn't want to resort to using their cutlass or their sword or a pistol, because you wouldn't want to maim the prized recruit, right? You want to keep them in service. You can see in the background the Tower of London. This is on Tower Hill in London, and that was really the epicenter of impressment in the 18th century. And for a time, they actually kept men in the Tower of London until ships were ready on the Thames to sail. They would take the various men. Over time, there's prison ships that kept the men in the Thames. Here's another image. I like this image a lot. Nice colors, and this shows that this was a really unpopular practice. It was unpopular all throughout the Atlantic world. The British did it, in London. This is London again. You can see St. Paul's Cathedral in the background. But they also did it in the Western Hemisphere. They did it in the American colonies. And in this particular image, even the neighborhood dog is getting in.
Postpone forever.
Postpone
10 minutes, 4 hours, whatever.
4 hours. All right, we just bought ourselves a lot of time. No lunch today. All right. That was the lunch bell. So there was also a reputation that press gangs targeted any warm body, any living person. And that's alluded to in this image. If you see the guy in the green jacket, if you see his pocket there, there's a pair of scissors. And that, I think, suggests that he was probably a tailor. He's probably not a professional seaman. He also has a long coat, which is the opposite of what sailors would wear. They have a short coat. And so, it's kind of saying that, anybody's in the Navy. And what I found in my research is that this is actually false. That the Navy, more than anything, wanted men who could sail. And in fact, if you didn't have enough people that could sail, the ship was going to go down. The ship, was going to sink. So this is, I think, something of the myth of the press gang. What the press gang actually wanted, the really skilled sailors that were able to climb to the top of masts and were able to take in sail. And this was a real skilled, profession. If you look really closely, you might need to get your magnifying glass, but you see those small ant-like figures on top of the mast. This is a standard 74-gun British warship, and on a ship of this size, there would need to be 500 sailors. At least a third of them would need to have these really expert skills. And there was a rating on the ship that was called able seamen. So these were the able seamen as opposed to the ordinary seamen. Able seamen, they're also called top men because they were able to climb to the top. They had the agility, the strength, and the know-how to control all the sails on the vessel. Just to give you a close-up of this practice, this was a real skill. I think of it almost like being a trapeze artist, where they had to, balance more than 100 feet in the air. If you're taking in sail on a warship like this, it usually means there's bad conditions. It means that there's bad weather, that you need to take away your propulsion. So it was dangerous work. And these are the men that, in a different time, might have resorted to piracy. Right? These are the men that might have done something different. They didn't want to be in the Navy because they can make a lot more money during wartime outside of the Navy. Merchant shipping and merchant wages skyrocketed in wartime because of scarcity, because of the smuggling, and so they would like to be anywhere else that they could. So when I started working on this, there hadn't been many other people writing about impressment, and I do kind of think of it as a form of state-sponsored piracy. And one person that had written some about it is the book that you have in front of you, Marcus Rediger, who was once a professor here at Georgetown. This is one of his most recent books, and he's just a beautiful writer, and I think you'll enjoy the work a lot. When I came to the subject, I think one of the main questions was, how bad was impressment? How bad was it to be impressed? And I kind of posed a different question, and that was, if impressment was so bad, how was the Royal Navy so good? How did they do so well? And this is my little spoiler alert. So if you plan to buy my book, you want to put your hands on yours right now. But my answer to this was basically that it was that bad. It was not something that sailors liked at all. And the Royal Navy was that good. And the reason why is because they targeted these professionals that performed quite well at sea. And part of the reason is they didn't have a choice. They were captured and they faced discipline, but they also, I think, saw it in their self-interest to perform well. It was really kind of the brotherhood of the sea. It was part of being a crew. But that didn't make it popular, and so there was always ways to resist impressment. And this gets back to kind of the spirit of the pirates. One of my favorite ways to resist being impressed is disguise, including cross-dressing. And you can see in this print, the sailor trying to dress like a woman, and I think he kind of overdid it. I think it's kind of like a mummy there, but it has a great title. Jack, and that refers to the sailor, Jack Tar. Jack detected sailing under false colors. If sailors couldn't escape through disguise or just running away, they would often riot. And there's these famous riots that take place all around the Atlantic world against press gangs. The biggest and most famous one took place because of this gentleman, and he looks like such a nice guy, Admiral Charles Knowles. He actually caused a huge impressment riot in 1747 in Antigua, and the reason why is because he took men off of privateers. Getting back to the issue of privateers, that made everybody in the Caribbean upset, and so they rioted against him. He went from Antigua to Boston, where he caused the biggest disturbance, the biggest riot, biggest act against British colonial control in the 18th century until the Stamp Act riots, until the American Revolution. So he took 50 men from the Boston wharves because he needed them, and that's what the British Navy did. It took men, but he took the wrong men. He took Boston men. He took Massachusetts men, and so the whole town erupted in a riot. And for 3 days, it ended any normal business in Boston. And one tactic of the crowd is they took Knowles's men. They took, if he was going to take Boston men, they were going to take his crew hostage. And so this went on and on until finally Knowles turned all the guns of his fleet on the town of Boston. And this was the maximum firepower of the day. This was a big deal. If all these naval ships were going to shoot. And he said, "By God, I'll now see if the king's government is not as good as a mob." You want to add an R at the end of that one. In the movie version of my book, there'll be the R. And at that point, the crowd finally gave up this fight against Admiral Knowles. His men were released, and he took his guns off of the town. After that, everyone basically avoided being part of this huge crowd in Boston that had taken over the town for 3 days. Even though we have evidence that involved thousands, I mean, it's not a huge place, but a couple of thousand people were involved in this, but everyone blended on the usual suspects. It was the foreigners, it was the young, it was blacks, they target all the people that did it, except one person. Samuel Adams, at that time, published a newspaper, and he did just the opposite. He said that not only was the riot something that he believed in, but it was absolutely necessary because Knowles and the Massachusetts colonial government had basically reduced conditions to a state of nature. They, instead of protecting the people, they had made war on the people, and that it was a duty in that case to resist. Adams was fresh off of completing his master's studies at Harvard. And you'll love this. The topic of his master's thesis at Harvard was when it was legitimate to resist civil authority. Talk about perfect education leading to action. So this became a real life laboratory for his ideas, and he basically introduced the idea of Lockean resistance in the American colonies, that it was an obligation to people to resist when government had failed. And of course, these were the ideas that would come back about 20 years later during the American Revolutionary Crisis. During the Revolution, the Americans faced threats from the press gangs, and then those threats continued after the American Revolution, even after the United States had become a country, had independence. The British Navy continued to impress American sailors because they claimed that they couldn't tell the difference between Americans and Britons at sea. And this relates, I think, to the larger topic of piracy, because in the American newspapers, that's what they accuse the British of being, basically being pirates, being tyrannical pirates. The word is used time and time again. And the Americans tried different ways to protect themselves. They actually, I think, almost invented the idea of the individual passport. We talked about the ship passport earlier. They created these documents called Citizenship Protections that American sailors were supposed to carry to sea to protect themselves against British press gangs. And they had a symbol of the United States, they had the eagle, and then they had any identifying marks for that particular sailor. So in this case, the sailor is Matthias Verena. He was issued this particular protection at Marblehead, Massachusetts on May 3rd, 1804. And the little handwriting there identifies that he was 24 years old. He stood 5 foot 6 inches. He was of light complexion, and he had a scar on his left knee. you think that this would be enough, that the British press gang would look at all this and say, oh yeah, that's him, there's the scar. But what happened is that these protections became a hot commodity in the Atlantic world. And every British sailor wanted one, as well as the American sailors. And in the British National Archives today, there's a whole file of confiscated forgeries, forged protection certificates, and a lot of them have a little bit of the thing erased, different things written in, and so the British tried to pass as Americans. And again, these are individuals that in another time might have resorted to piracy against the British state. And piracy is kind of in the eye of the beholder. I think that's one of the themes of today's talks. And so just as the Americans are seeing the British as the pirates, I think the British were seeing the Americans as the ultimate pirates, the pirate nation that were attracting their sailors in different ways. And so I think this is a fitting place to stop. Eventually this practice of impressment led to war between the United States and Britain, the War of 1812. But after that war, I think at least this chapter of piracy ended in the Atlantic. You see a real decline of privateering. You see really the end of press gangs. Eventually the British state grows enough that it can have a permanent navy and a permanent naval reserve. But as we've seen, there's a lot of legacies from this era that persist to this day. Piracy still exists in different parts of the world, and I'm sure you can find it in the Caribbean. Modern day privateers exist in many different forms, but one I think is in terms of war contractors like Halliburton and Blackwater. I don't even know what Blackwater is called anymore, but it has a different name. These companies that became so famous during the Iraq War. And impressment exists in various conscription systems, in drafts. And so I guess maybe the takeaway here is as long as war exists, as long as capitalism exists, and as long as we have modern states, there's going to be both private and state forms of piracy. Thank you.
When Drake was on his raiding forays along the California coast, he left a marker up in Northern California, which became known as the Drake Plate.
Okay.
I'm sure you know about that. And when I first learned about it from a very good professor in California in the early 70s, I went up to the Bancroft Library to see the marker.
Okay.
And then for 20 years, I would teach my students about the Drake Plate. And then in the early 90s, I revisited the Bancroft Library. Come to find out, it was a fraud.
Okay.
Do you know the story?
Yeah, I don't. Maybe so I missed this, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, whatever became of the Drake Plate?
It makes sense because in that era, especially the French, this was a French practice, but the English did it as well, they would leave markers at different places where they went, and the French famously buried plates in areas that they were claiming. So it makes sense, but completely false, huh?
I guess I got to keep searching.
Yeah. Well, you should write the article about the Drake plate. I like it.
While you're in Ghana too.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is just an addendum. Since we've been talking about the popular culture perception of pirates, I just learned last night at my daughter's swim practice from an elementary school teacher that the writer of young adult novels, Avi, A-V-I, has written a novel, I forgot the name, I can maybe get it, sure, about a British girl who's captured by pirates and then begins to kind of have personal misgivings about whether she's British or whether she's part of the pirate culture.
Wow.
But middle school and upper elementary school kids, boys and girls, are reading this book.
That's great. Yeah, I have a fourth grader and a sixth grader, and I do a lot of talks and teach about things, and usually they just kind of yawn and they don't care. But today I was going off to talk to them about pirates, right? And they brighten up and like, oh really? You're talking about pirates? And one thing that's really interesting about that is that they were an object of fascination in the 18th century, the 17th century and 18th century as well, right? They were maybe for slightly different reasons in a different way, but they were bestsellers of that era too. So I think there's something about them that has captured the imagination across time.